Thank you so much for coming. Very cheerful topic. So, before we start to talk about famine, some background. Before the industrialization, Soviet Union was largely an agrarian country. 80% of the population were peasants. In addition, these peasants were very poor and agriculture was very backward. And so before the industrialization, after communists took power, there was all these debates about how to reform agriculture, how to make it more efficient. And the solution the communists believed in were collective farms. They believed that on the collective farms, peasants would be working together happily, freely, will be able to utilize economies of scale, and therefore would be able to use machines that were too expensive for each individual peasant. And so collectivization was seen as the solution to the inefficiency and backwardness of the Russian countryside. So this was all theoretical debates, but in the late 1928, Stalin finally consolidated power within the Communist Party, and he started the first 5-year plan for industrializing the country. So suddenly, it was not only a theoretical question, suddenly the government had to feed fast-growing cities. Okay, thank you. So suddenly the government had to feed the cities. So instead of theoretical debates, the government started wholesale collectivization campaign in the late 1929. So the very short timeline of the famine. In the late 1929, collectivization campaign starts. 1930 was the first year when collective farms constituted a significant chunk of agriculture. And it was good. The harvest was good, the government was very optimistic, grain collections went relatively easily, so everything seems to be fine. However, 2 next years were a disaster. The harvest was very low in 1931, so in the winter of 1932, in many rural areas, the famine started. However, the government ignored the reports about low harvest in the famine, and in 1932, the harvest was low again, and in the winter of 1933, winter and spring, there was a huge spike in mortality. There was a famine. However, after these 2 years of bad harvest and increased mortality, harvest in 1933 was good, so the food crisis was resolved. And I'm studying this famine. I'm trying to understand what was going on. So just to give you some background, Robert Conquest estimates the number of victims as 10 million in this famine. So Russian parliament issued a decree in 2008 saying that 7 million people died. So the truth is probably in between. But in Ukraine alone, according to contemporary demographers, excess mortality constituted between 2.6 million to 3.4 million, out of a population of 30 million. This is huge. Imagine 10% of the population just dies in 1 year. Okay, so there is, of course, a lot of literature on this famine, and most of this literature is in history, not in economics. So, and there are many reasons offered explaining this famine. So, Davis and Whitcroft argue that the drought of 1931 triggered the famine, and they give extensive information about the weather, the harvest, and the grain collections. Conquest adds that the kulakization, the removal of kulaks of the most productive and richest peasants, must have contributed to the famine. Other versions include, of course, genocide against Ukrainians, and there is even the theory that starvation was a cheap substitute for more deportations and killings. But it's all historical literature. There is practically no data analysis. The only economic paper about the similar famine is a paper by Nancy Chan and friends that studies the famine that happened after collectivization of agriculture in China. And what they find is that areas that were producing more grain had higher famine mortality. And the reason they offer, the explanation they offer, is the information. They argue that because the government could not observe the real harvest, it extracted too much from areas that were known to usually produce more. As a result, creating artificial famine is in richer areas. So in this paper, I argue that there is another obvious but overseen channel that was increasing famine mortality: incentives. I argue that collectivization destroyed incentives to work. As a result, grain production must have dropped, which contributed to the famine mortality. And also, I argue that the effect of collectivization, the effect of drop in production, is comparable in magnitude with the effect of mortality, with the increase of mortality due to overprocurement. Okay, in more details, what I argue is that first, I confirm Nancy Chan's finding that more productive areas had higher mortality due to too much procurement. In addition, there is another channel. More collectivized areas had higher mortality because of drop in production. And these two channels, they offset each other. The more you're collectivized, the less you produce because you lose incentives to work. But you also observe harvest better on collective farms because it's easier to see how much was produced on one collective farm instead of searching each individual household. And as a result, you over-procure less. Okay, so in this work, I concentrate on Ukraine for 3 reasons. First, because Ukraine was hit the most. Proportionally, if you believe the estimates demographers give, half of the all mortality happened in Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine was the grain basket of the Soviet Union. It supplied up to 40% of all procured grain. So all the imbalances of the government policies must have been present in Ukraine. And finally, Ukraine had excellent statistics, and I'm using it. So I have district-level data. In 1933, Ukraine was divided in 8 provinces and in approximately 400 districts, and I'm using it. Okay, so my data comes from different sources. Mortality data comes from the Russian State Archive of the Economy. Everything else comes from published sources. So I have extremely good statistics published in 1925 by Ukrainian Statistical Bureau. In addition, I use census data and I use a lot of maps. Okay, so this is how Russian archives look like. Yeah. Okay, this is the mortality data. So what's interesting about this data is that usually in Moscow, statisticians didn't collect such a disaggregated data. Districts are tiny, and there are hundreds and thousands of districts in the Soviet Union. But presumably, because the mortality in 1933 was so high, the statisticians in Moscow requested local statisticians to send them the original mortality data on district level. And it was preserved in the secret part of the archive. Okay, so some summary statistics. In 1933, average mortality was 64 per 1,000. It's huge. As a comparison, in 1927, in normal year, average mortality was 18 per 1,000. What else? Collectivization rate was also. So I have collectivization data for 1930, a bit earlier. So in 1930, average collectivization rate, the share of household in collective farms was 37%, but it varied a lot, from 2% to 90%. What else is interesting here is that even though Ukraine was the grain basket of the country, it was still very poor. Average household had less than 1 cow in Ukraine. Literacy rate was extremely low, 40% on average. Urbanization was also very low, just 13%. So it was, by contemporary standards, it was a poor agrarian country. Okay, so this is how Ukrainian mortality looks on the map. You see the highest mortality is concentrated in Kyiv and Kharkiv provinces. And to give some, and also what's striking here is that even by officially registered data, there are districts that had mortality of 240 per thousand, meaning that officially registered quarter of the population just died in 1 year in some areas. Okay, so this is how collectivization looks in 1930. So even just by eyeballing two pictures, you can probably guess that there is some correlation between collectivization and famine. And also just to give some background information about Ukrainian economy, I also plot amount of land per rural household. You see, the southeastern part of Ukraine had more land per household, and land was the most valuable asset. So southeastern part, the black earth part, was the rich part. What else? Amount of grain produced per household. There was almost one-to-one correlation between amount of land you have and amount of grain you produce. What else? So northwestern part concentrated more on potatoes, and here are the cows per household. Again, so rich southeastern part, and this one more substituting away from grain, concentrating on cows. Okay, also literacy rate. Again, this part is richer and has more literate population. And also, once we talk about the famine in Ukraine, we necessarily talk about the genocide. So that's how Ukrainians were distributed within Ukraine. Okay, so first, before studying collectivization, I just confirmed Nancy Chan's finding that grain productivity increased mortality. So if you look at the correlation, column 1, there seems to be no relationship. However, once I control for the wealth, for the value of agricultural equipment per capita, I see that the more grain you produce, the higher famine mortality you get. And the effect is stable, super statistically significant, and it's actually very large in magnitude. I will talk about the size of the effects later. Okay, second, before actually studying the effects of collectivization, I want to see what was driving collectivization, because of course it's endogenous. So what I do, I divide all districts into two groups, where collectivization was below median and above the median. And I compare the means of characteristics of each group. And what I see is that more collectivized districts had higher literacy rate, had lower population density, were producing more grain, had higher value of equipment. So it looks like more collectivized districts were more agriculturally productive and richer. I also compare them by urban characteristics, and there seem to be no difference. So share of industrial workers, distance, all sorts of distances, industrial output per capita, it doesn't matter. Finally, I also have data on the government control of the territory, the number of rural Soviets per capita, and it doesn't seem to be increasing collectivization. And I also have data on preferences towards collectivization, share of house, number of collective farms in 1925 per capita. And I do see that areas that had more collective farms in 1925 had higher collectivization in 1930, even though in 1925 it was not forced, it was voluntary. Okay. Yeah, so these were just simple mean comparisons. When I do OLS, when I start doing regressions, what I see is that the most important driver of collectivization is the wealth, the value of agricultural equipment per house, per capita. And then once I include wealth, grain production doesn't matter. What's also interesting here is that, for example, horses are also also increasing collectivization. So I think what was going on is that the government tried to take control over territories that had more equipment, that were potentially better in producing grain. What's also interesting here is that share of Ukrainians positive. Okay, so now, presumably we believe that the government tried to collectivize areas that were richer, that had more equipment. And now I want to show that collectivization was actually increasing mortality. So what I do is first I just do a simple linear regression. I regress mortality on collectivization and some controls. So even without any controls, collectivization is increasing mortality. Of course, I know that it's endogenous, so I try to control for wealth and alternative food sources. So cows, value of agricultural equipment, because we know it was driving collectivization up. Share of Ukrainians, I do see that still collectivization is increasing mortality. The coefficient is stable, highly statistically significant, and is actually high in magnitude. Okay, but we still may worry that collectivization is endogenous. So it is possible that, for example, more unequal areas where there were more very rich peasants and more very poor peasants poor peasants were more willing to join collective farms. They were promised the implements of their rich neighbors. So it is possible that what I observe as an effect of collectivization may, for example, be an effect of higher inequality in these districts. So I want an instrument. I want to find something that is increasing collectivization, but is not affecting mortality other than through collectivization. And here's my instrument. So I want to use Stalin's Dizzy with Success article published on March 2nd of 1930. So what happened? In the late 1929, wholesale collectivization campaign started. Peasants were pushed in their collective farms, but they were so much opposed to it that by the end of the winter of 1930, the country was on the verge of whole-scale peasant revolt, and Stalin had to back off. On March 2nd, he published this famous article arguing that the local officials were the ones to blame. The local officials were dizzy with success of collectivization, and they forgot that joining collective farms should be voluntary, should not be forced. As a result, after this publication, peasants started leaving collective farms massively. But to leave the collective farm, you need to get the land allotment from the collective farm. And in areas where spring started earlier, you had less time to get the land back, because you had to get the land before the spring sowing. So basically, in areas where spring temperature was higher, peasants were stuck in the collective farms. They didn't have much time to leave. As a result, higher temperature should have increased collectivization rate. So as an instrument, I used normalized April temperature of 1930. The difference between temperature in April 1930 minus the average temperature. So if I have unexpectedly warmer April, I have to start sowing unexpectedly earlier, and I don't have time to leave the collective farm. Therefore, it should be increasing collectivization. And that's exactly what that's exactly what I see. So the first stage, I do see that higher temperature in April is increasing collectivization, controlling for everything. Okay, and so when I use this instrument to estimate the impact of collectivization on mortality, what happens is that my coefficient of the impact of collectivization mortality actually doubles compared to the OLS estimates, which means that probably my OLS estimates were biased downward. So indeed, if you have, and this is indeed what happens if you have that richer areas were collectivized faster, they have higher mortality because of collectivization, but because they are rich, they also, being rich reduces mortality because you have more resources that help you survive the famine. Okay, so the size of the effect. In my OLS estimates, one standard deviation increase in collectivization increases mortality by 8 to 11 people per thousand. In the IV estimates, one standard deviation increase in collectivization increases mortality by 20 people per thousand. It's huge, given that normal mortality at the time would be 18 per thousand. Okay, so proving that collectivization was increasing mortality is nice, but it's sort of obvious. We know that the famine started soon after the collectivization, so of course collectivization must have played a role. So what we really want to do is we want to understand why was it increasing mortality. And so, to look at the mechanisms, I'll do the following. I estimate the effect of collectivization on mortality, of grain on mortality, and I look at the interaction between the two. So what happens here? I see that collectivization increases mortality. Grain production increases mortality. We have already seen that. If I include both of them, they both work simultaneously. They both are increasing mortality. But if I include the interaction between collectivization and grain production, the interaction coefficient is negative, controlling for everything, controlling for literacy rate, cows, equipment, everything. Yeah, so what it means is that the effect of collectivization, it's not only about grain collections, because it's much, much easier to take grain from the collective farm. To take the grain from individual households, you have to search households one by one, hundreds of them. It's costly. It's much easier to take grain from the collective. But if the interaction coefficient is negative, it must be that they were not, if collectivization was only about taking the grain, the interaction coefficient must have been positive, and it's not. So there is something else going on. In addition, what I see, if I play with the distance to the railroad, what we think is that the closer you are to the railroad, the easier it is to take the grain away. It's cheaper to transport grain if you're close to the railroad. So indeed, if I look at the interaction between grain and the distance to the railroad, it's negative. The further away you're from the railroad, conditional on grain production, the less mortality you have, because it's more difficult to take the grain away. But the interaction between the distance to railroad and collectivization is positive. The further away you're from railroad, the more mortality you get. So it's not. It also hints that the collectivization was not about taking the grain, or not only about taking the grain away. Okay, finally. So what I think was going on is that on collective farms, it's costly to monitor how people work. It's difficult to force people to work, especially in the large collective farms. And I think that collective farms must have been producing less grain, and therefore this drop in production must have contributed to the famine mortality. And to test this, I look at the number of households per collective farm. So fixed collectivization rate, conditional on the same collectivization rate, the larger collective farms you have, the more mortality you have. This must be because of drop in production, because grain collections cannot explain this data. So, also from the narrative history, I know that on these newly created collective farms, the work done was not recorded properly. Peasants were often rewarded according to the number of eaters in the family, not the amount of the work done. And also collective farms didn't have predefined grain collections quota. So I argue that what happened is that because of the lack of incentives to work on collective farms, peasants decreased the effort, drop in production, increased mortality. Okay, so what also points in this direction is that in 1933, the government had to change the procurement policies. They advertised that starting from 1933 onwards, the collective farm will have a predefined amount of grain to procure. They banned local officials from increasing collections, so now the collective farm will know how much grain it will have to procure, and most importantly, it allowed households to have individual plot of land and to grow whatever on this plot of land and to sell it on the free collective farm markets without controlled prices. So if you look at the size of the effect, consider this 4x4 matrix. So imagine I have low collectivization, high collectivization districts, and I have low grain, high grain districts. If I go from low collectivization to high collectivization, mortality increases by 17 per thousand. If I go from low grain to high grain, mortality increases by 19 per thousand. I argue that this increase is due to drop in production, due to lack of incentives to work on collective farms. This increase, according to the information theory, is due to over-procurement from the more collectivized areas. And once we go to the more collectivized and more grain areas, what we see is that these two effects, they don't add up linearly. They offset each other. The more collectivization you have, the less you produce, but the better you observe the harvest. So the less you over-procure. As a result, this is not 36, but only 20 per thousand. So basically, what else do I have? I also consider all possible alternative channels I have data for. So I do see that the more tractors you had, the less mortality you have, although the effect is not very significant and the data is not very good on that. So I also see that the more Soviets per capita you have, the less mortality you have. Probably the government having more information could have changed its procurement policies again. What else? I don't see that support for collective farms was changing mortality in any way. Finally, I also see that the more households there are that hire or employ workers, the higher mortality there was. So probably the higher inequality there was, the more mortality there was. But these are all very small in magnitude effects. The main effects are from collectivization and grain production. So as a conclusion, what I argue is that the Soviet government destroyed incentives to work and therefore created artificial famine that millions died in.
So first of all, before I turn it on, it's actually a great paper. The only thing that I would probably focus it slightly more different. Control L. So I don't want to repeat introduction. This is a tough time. This is actually a very hard topic, and it's partially, could be partially politically motivated. You cannot avoid politics discussing this. So it's all started with collectivization, and this was like for greater good thing. So they all communists believe that this is really a great thing, and still started from Lenin. And the only thing that they actually were not sure when to do this. So at the end of the day, they decided to force it at some point. And parallel with collectivization, there was this ongoing process of decolonization. So and these things, it didn't touch only Ukraine. It touched almost like everyone. Even actually, my wife's grandmother ran away with her brother, and was able to avoid all the negative consequences of being decolonized, and later being sent to prison her brother and father actually died in prison of starvation. Maybe it was even related to this time of famine. And it was not in Ukraine, it was in Bashkortostan. So it's pretty much tough topic to discuss, and everyone, it's like artificially created famine. Famine created by the Soviet Union officials, basically by policies of collectivization, and everything is related to it. It severely hit Ukraine and many other regions. These regions are mentioned in United Nations Declaration, which does not state that this was a genocide, but they say that they express sympathy with people who've been affected, and especially Ukrainians. So why this politically, partially political topic? This famine in Ukraine quite often referred to as Holodomor, which actually believes that this was intentional, not intentional like taking out stuff, but intentional murdering of people. So Stalin saw a threat in uprising, especially from Ukrainian peasants, because they were relatively rich, and he used famine as a cheap substitute for mass killing. So there are no documents to support it. We don't know whether it was the case, but the debate is huge about it. So two sides of it. What I see is that like probably the contribution of this paper is that it's more likely to support the alternative. It's more likely to support actually that they didn't want to kill people. I mean, they wanted to get grain from them, but so much death was unintentional. So yes, this paper is in Ukraine. It has very detailed data set only because of this data set. The paper can be really great. And so for each district, there is a data set. There is a data on mortality, data on collectivization, data on some economics variables of 1925, which could later be used in this paper as a proxy for procurement, for example. So what happened? What can we learn from here? So there was a collectivization, and at the same time there were extreme weather shocks. And as an output, we see huge mortality, disastrous famine and huge mortality. There was another effect of procurement, which was parallel to collectivization. It's not directly related to collectivization, but it also, of course, affected mortality. So what specifically was that? One thing is that the government needed to get money to basically to produce tanks, most importantly. And the only way to get it was to selling grain. They started more or less successfully. They bought grain from peasants, and they sold it to outside markets, and they used cash for their military expenditure. So at some point they decided that they're not making enough. They decided to reduce the price of the grain, and as a consequence, peasants decided that they don't want to procure so much grain, and basically substituted away. So then there was as a result, there was a forced procurement. So people basically came into farms. So before that, it was like private market of intermediate people who bought it from peasants and sold it to government. But now there were no more place for them. And actually, NKVD, people directly related to army came to farms and got grain from peasants. And still they paid for it, but still it was no more free market anymore. So let me now get to this paper, specifically what this paper does. So the proxy, I think the main equation is this one. She measures the effect of collectivization and procurement, a joint effect of collectivization and procurement on mortality in 1933. As a proxy for procurement, there was a wheat and rye production in 1925, with the idea is that the more it was produced back then, the more it should be produced now and the more we want to take. And both of these effects are positive. So let's get a bit more detail into this black box. So first of all, how much of these things are new? This is an article of 1933. Immediately, it was Financial Times, I think. So the main result of 5-year plan, basically at that time they already noticed a lot of the stuff that was going on. 5-year plan has been a ruin of Russian agriculture. The main reason for the catastrophe was actually collectivization. The policy of creating large collective farms basically completely destroyed the incentives. This is the main effect that this paper talks about. The massacre of cattle, peasants who had to join collective farms, they didn't want to give cattle away. They instead decided to eat them right now, and they killed about half of the animals before joining collective farms. So, and one more thing, there was 6 or 7 best workers from the whole USSR have been uprooted and deprived of their land, and a lot of them were executed, put to prison, and sent away to Siberia. So he also noticed at that time that those were best producers. So you took millions of best producers and you send them out, and this could be a catastrophe for any country. So those 3 could be attributed as direct effects of collectivization, and they all will positively contribute to mortality. So collectivization will contribute to mortality through at least these 3 effects. So addition is procurement. But what I think is the really great part of this paper is that she's able to show that these 2 effects, she's able to show the joint effect of collectivization and procurement. So 2 possible channels are here. First of all, if there are more collective farms, it's much easier to procure, it's much easier to take away grain from people. But there is a second effect when these things could interact. If there are more collective farms, there's much more observability, and if we really don't want to kill people from starvation, we would actually adjust the procurement if we see that there is nothing produced. So, and I think that this is the contribution, the most important contribution of this paper is that it distinguishes between these effects, these 2 effects, and these 3 effects, kind of direct effects of collectivization, and the effects of combined procurement and collectivization. And more importantly, she is able to show that this is much more quantitatively much higher than this one. So these 2 cannot be distinguished separately, because these two cannot be identified separately, but the joint effect can be identified with this regression that she runs. And she's able to show that more observability has much higher effect. So basically this supports that we are, so this supports this channel, that when people come to farms, when people come to individual farms, they don't know how much produced. They literally search for grain. They get as much as they can. When they come to granaries in kolkhozes, they see that there is not much produced. So they may take less. So, and this is shown by this regression. And what I understood is this result, the negative part here. It's pretty much stable whether you include many other controls or not. So now, finally, let me also show a weak point of this, which I believe is a weak point of this paper. So I want to go back to this slide where all reasons for all effects of collectivization were discussed, and I want to draw your attention to this last point, where actually millions of best producing workers have been imprisoned and sent away. So in this paper, this variable, wheat and rye in 1925, which is how much wheat and rye was produced per capita in 1925, is used as a proxy for effect of procurement. The logic is that the more they produce before, the more they must be producing now, and the more we can take away. So, but when literally the best producers are deprived of their land and forced into exile, this may significantly change the district composition, and so it's quite possible that at least this has to be tested for, that a rich district will become poor district and vice versa. So my fear is that this may be capturing a slightly different effect. This may be capturing exactly the reverse of this composition of poor versus rich districts, and therefore this is the effect of not procurement but collectivization. Well, it still does not explain negative coefficient interaction that Natalya received here. So, so it's still like it may not be the case. That's what I'm trying to say. Well, I still believe that there needs to be more evidence to support that this variable is a good proxy for procurement. So basically, this is it. Now you can ask questions.
So thank you very much for such an interesting topic. It's history, but for example, thank you. Thank you very much once more. Well, it's all history, but it's still important for our families. For example, my family has suffered from all this stuff, and so you're saying that it wasn't intentional, all these negative effects, but maybe you know such other like articles or papers, or maybe you have counted it by yourself. What would have been the effect, the positive effect of free market? For example, let's say if it would have been then, maybe the guys who were on power, they could have produced more tanks if it would have been a free market. Or is it possible to count it or to investigate it somehow? Thank you.
Okay. Well, yeah, basically I argue that if there was free market, if there was no collectivization, then there would have been no famine, but it's sort of obvious. I don't know how to quantitatively estimate the aggregate effect.
There is a paper that actually compares.
Yeah, there is an excellent paper by Golsov, Guriev, and Tsivinsky, Guriev, and someone else about the effects of Stalin, about the aggregate effects of Stalin's policies. Yeah, you can look into that.
Okay, my question is the following. Is it appropriate to present such simple black and white picture with 4 bullets, trying to explain this very complicated, let's say, process or situation? Soviet Union, it was a huge country, and the collectivization, the story of collectivization in different regions of the country were very different. The central part of Russia, with the story of I don't know, крепостное право, where people work together. It was actually collective farms, kind of. Ukraine, it's different story. Kazakhstan, it's different story. So, telling about collectivization, we are stressing Ukraine, Kazakhstan, this is different cases. Even there, Kazakhstan, this is not because, I don't know, free-minded people, because they are raising the cows, cattle, yes. It was different process of agriculture, which was uneasy, impossible maybe to redesign on this way. As for Ukraine, it's different. As for central part of Russia, it's another story. Even Eastern Belarus, it was another story, you know, because it's very close to central part of Russia. So did you try to find any connection from the point of view of the story of development of agriculture, I don't know, procedure, whatever, and the format of production or processing? Because here I believe it's very simple to explain, just kulaks, and everything collapses.
Okay, so I have several answers to that. First, there is a recent paper by Markevich and Zhuravskaya about serfdom in Russia, about the effect of abolition of serfdom. And so what they see is that immediately after the abolition of serfdom, agricultural productivity rises due to nothing but incentives, because to adopt new technologies, you need time. But they see the immediate effect of abolition of serfdom. And so what I see here is that immediately after collectivization, production must have dropped. So I see the reversal. Abolition of serfdom increases productivity. Collectivization must have been decreasing productivity. So it's kind of very intuitive. It's exactly the same effect, only working in the other direction. So it is true that Kazakhstan was different, and of course, each territory, even each small district, is unique. But despite this fact, we do what we can. We study averages.
Lots of data on one region. We don't go outside of Ukraine.
Yeah, and I concentrate on Ukraine not because I want to study genocide or anything, just because I think Ukraine was the most important from the perspective of grain production in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick reflections. So I don't know much about this, and I don't have a personal connection to the historical things we're talking about here. But I was just thinking, I mean, is it possible that to some extent the actual implementation of collectivization was also reflected by the willingness to somehow go after these regions and the people in these regions because they were thought about as politically not supportive? And therefore, for the same reasons, I mean, these regions not being politically supportive and so on, you may care less about what happens in terms of starvation, so that, you know, the actual implementation of collectivization is also reflecting to some extent the extent to which you care about, you know, preventing starvation in these particular regions. Second question has to do with, I mean, the incentives, and I mean, the incentives we know from economic theory, it makes a lot of sense, and I believe in that. But on the other hand, if you're fearing starvation and death, those are pretty strong incentives as well. So I mean, in that situation, shouldn't people, if they understand, you know, the implications, or why didn't they understand the implications? Because, you know, even in a collective form, I would expect those incentives to take override in a sense.
Yeah, it's a pure collective action problem. Imagine collective farm, 300 peasants, nobody else is working. Even if you work, you can't change anything. And even if you work, you're rewarded not according to the work done, because it's not recorded. You're rewarded according to the number of eaters in your family. So, on one hand, yes, it's crazy that people stopped working, and therefore they had nothing to eat. On the other hand, from economic perspective, it's just a pure collective action game.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One maybe proposal, maybe the better proxy for procurement will be industrialization, because if you take into account process collectivization and industrialization in USSR, large part of cheap capital was taken from United States. Mm-hmm. And if you take into account the Great Depression in the United States, the lack of this cheap capital led to lack for investment capital in USSR. So they just wheat and rye, it will be the reason to take Ukraine for procurement, but industrialization was one of the reasons for proxy for procurement.
So how it works is that the government takes the grain to the central granary, probably even outside Ukraine, and then it distributes it among the urban territories and exports some. So you can think about all the grain taken to Moscow and then distributed in the Soviet Union. So local grain collections don't go to the local urban areas. Therefore, local urbanization or industrialization doesn't matter.
Okay, but one of the reasons for the procurement may be the lack of investments for industrialization in USSR. They do not have capital for industrialization. They decided to take this money from wheat export, and they decided to pick Ukraine due to great, large wheat rye output in 1925. Maybe this will be.
Yeah, but I need a proxy for procurement from each small local district. So on aggregate, you're right. You procure more if you need money for industrialization. But each small, tiny district, like in Kyiv province, in Kharkov province, they don't procure more because they want to industrialize this particular small district more.
They need industrialization not only for Ukraine, but also for the other parts of the Soviet Union. They just pick Ukraine as due to large wheat rye production. Okay.
It was the main, not the large, the main. This is the first reason. The second, port capacity. Odessa, not the Moscow, but Odessa was the main center where they collect the grain for export region. So two reasons, yes. And Ukraine is not separate in their mind. Something it was part.
On a more technical level, the instrument, I'm still a little confused. So, decollectivization, how did it take, I mean, presumably peasants who were already in a collective farm didn't have the grain stock anyway, so why does the timing matter of kind of the breakup of the kolkhoz, or kind of the sowing campaign of that year? So if I'm going to be delivered a piece of land and some grain stock, why not just deliver me a piece of land with the grain already in it, already sown?
I need to think about it, but so it's just from historical sources. I've literally just been reading Whitcroft's book, and he said that Ukraine didn't benefit too much from the Stalin's article. Siberia benefited more because in Siberia people had more time to live collective farms. So it's like anecdotally it's from Whitcroft, but yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. One quick point. You know, from my understanding, it was a bit brilliant research, and what I'm starting to think right now, this is interesting for two reasons. For better understanding what's happened at that time, from the point of view of this calculation. And on the other hand, let's imagine that we have Stalin right now and he decides to privatize everything. Agriculture collapsed. So the main idea you need to think about and understand what is it all agriculture about from the point of view of storage, of processing, because the privatizing can ruin agriculture at the same way. Is we just take Bulgaria, by the way, they ruined their agriculture because. So be careful. Stalin can do both, collectivize and privatize.
Wait, well, actually, this paper.
I think I have to respond to this. I just want to congratulate you for this research. It made me think about the mass movement of Koreans from Far East, Vladivostok area to Central Asia and so on. But also, to answer your question, I think what could be added to this research is productivity measure, which should be available at least, just quantity divided by number of people, who are working in the agriculture sector in different formats. And I think that would be crucial to explain what incentive effects there actually were. I mean, I think it's just too, blunt to assume that once you collectivize, then, productivity, or people would not have been willing to till the land, or they would have, killed off the cows. Perhaps it was also a mistake that you do collectivization without thinking through what would be the effect on productivity. But what triggered an interest in my mind was, why did Stalin move all these, tens of thousands of Koreans from Far East? I mean, in Vladivostok area, I was told that Korean sort of cooperatives had much higher productivity than the local population. So maybe it was to replenish the skilled farm workers who were, who disappeared. I didn't know about decolonization, but I think that would be central to this kind of research. And then, not only taking Ukraine as an example, but take a random sample of different areas where this kind of data exists and collectivization happened at different times. But I do think it's also equally as blunt to assume that if you privatize all farms in Belarus, then we would have difficulty feeding people. Well, in some form or another, you're talking about the taxation of what agricultural workers produce, and it happened not only under communism but also under feudal system. It happened, in kingdoms and empires. So, thank you.
Okay, just to clarify, this paper argues that once you allow for private markets and private farms, productivity goes up, not down.
Thank you. That was